So we have a panel here that combined is about 100 years worth of experience. And so I want to really pick their brains and understand the threats and how to respond with an instant response. With instant response, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when and how. So that's what I want you to really understand, because instant response is something that Microsoft put together in 2002. The threats have changed a little since then. And now, have you heard in the other sessions, we've got AI being used against us. And so the threats are evolving even faster. And I hear companies that say that, well, we're compliant, we're ISO, and we've got the CSF. How long does it take a standard to become a standard? If it's NIST, it's 5 years. So you're state-of-the-art from 5 years ago, and you think that's okay. So it's not enough. So it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So I want to introduce the panelists. First, we got Steve, the Chief Cyber Business Officer for Cygnus. There's Steve. We got Scott. Scott's the resident attorney, so you can ask him the legal questions. If you attended the legal AI session, you learned about copyrights. It's not quite sorted out yet. A lot of it's still in litigation. Okay, you got Marie, privacy officer from Boeing, and you got Ian from the state of Washington, CISA. So a lot of experience here. So we ready to start?
Yes.
Okay, any latecomers, front row. Okay, so let's first start off with, so Ian, plan, practice the plan, follow the plan. Why don't you elaborate on that?
So at CISA, we try to get ahead of the issues you may have. We help you with assessments and planning and things like that. The big picture is we want to get left of boom, left of the incident. We want to plan as best we can ahead of time, the stuff you should be doing now, so that when you do actually go through an incident, you've done the documentation, you've done all those pieces and parts to ensure you're going to come out of the incident more successful than if you didn't plan.
Okay, Marie, you want to talk about IR planning?
Sure. So the one thing that I would add to that cycle of plan and follow your plan, et cetera, is that we kind of used a plan, do, check, act. And so the check part is the metrics that you keep of all of their reported incidents. And then the act is taking that intelligence from your after-action reviews and your metrics and feeding that back into your planning, whether that's prevention or part of your response plan that didn't really work. An example on that is our very first response plan after the 2003 first breach law got published had one line that said notify affected parties. And when your first incident involves 168,000 people and your second that follows right after is 360, that's woefully inadequate. So we definitely learned to do that continuous update cycle. So this should be a living document with real contact details in it and all of the detailed steps. So we can talk more about what steps should be in it, but I want to give the others some time for opening.
All right, next is Scott talking about data and the regulatory requirements for data.
And before I'm going to even talk about the data and regulatory requirements, two very, very, very important things that I think everyone needs to have a very good idea about left of the event. And one is, what is a breach versus what is an incident versus what's an event, okay? And I say that because getting that wrong is going to have terrible downstream effects for you down the road. For example, if you truly just had an incident that was contained with your organization, but it didn't amount to a breach, and you report it as a breach, contractually, you're likely going to have to report to all of your customer base. And that's going to be a very unpleasant discussion. Moreover, you may have to share incident reports with your base, which is very unpleasant. And you can tell unpleasantness is part of the lawyer job, and it goes downhill from there. So very important to have that distinction, because I can tell you when you do your SOC 2s down the road, they're going to ask you, did you have any breaches? And if you don't have a good idea of an incident versus a breach, you're going to be articulating things that, one, aren't true, and two, are actually putting you in a bad position. It's going to be the scarlet letter for you from that point forward. Secondly, having a very good idea of where your personal or controlled data is within your organization, and making sure that not only do you check that, but have an ability to confirm it either electronically or some other means to make sure that you have a very good idea where the data is, what the data is, and what the regulatory requirements are as a consequence if you lose control of it. Keep in mind that simply, in many cases, having a bad guy look at the data, just looking at the data, for example, the New York Shield Act, is enough to implicate the law, which means that you'll have to notify the authorities. So in sum, knowing where your data is and assuming that there's more data than meets the eye is going to be critical to success.
So let me pause and give some examples of regulatory data.
Just about any kind of data you can imagine is going to have some regulatory aspects. So, and it's not just, for example, HIPAA-controlled data, that is to say data that's medically or healthcare related, or financial data, things that are controlled by GLBA. You're going to find that things that are controlled at a state level. So now about a dozen states have laws protecting personal information, and that can be just about anything. California is a great example. They have all kinds of things that are considered personal data. Your browsing history on the internet, that's personal data, which is impressive. Purchases that you've made, for example, on Amazon, that's personal data. So you're going to find that a lot more data is controlled than you might have thought at first.
And I just wanted to add also, if you're a global company and you have offices in Europe, then pretty much anything about a person is personal data. And there, it's not just whether or not the data has been viewed by an outside party. It can also be considered a reportable incident if you have, let's say, a ransomware attack with no exfiltration, but just the data is unavailable and you can't restore it within a timely fashion. Now you're violating rights of individuals because they can't access their data.
All right, Steve. Tell us about vendors and third-party risk and so forth.
Sure, yeah. So, hey, Steve Curtis, Chief Cyber Business Officer at Cygnus. And the framework that we recommend is plan, practice, respond, and report. So it's very similar, but I think the theme that you're getting from everybody up here is be prepared. So having that plan, but the plan really should include not just the actions you're going to take, but who's going to take those actions. So it's more than a contact list, in my opinion. It's actually assigning the actions to the people or the people to the actions. And those actions should not only be your own stakeholders within your own organization, but also all of the different supporting organizations that you work with. So that might be your outside counsel. It might be an incident response firm that you work with to investigate the technical investigator. It might be your managed service provider if you outsource some of your IT stack, or maybe you have multiple different IT outsourcers or other kinds of business outsourcing. All of those folks will be in some manner responsible for different tasks during the incident response plan. So having the plan, knowing who your response team is, it's not just your own internal team, but those outside providers, assigning the tasks to each one of those, and then running some sort of a practice. It doesn't have to be a very sophisticated activity, but actually ensuring that everybody has access to the plan, that they know how to execute the plan, they know what those tasks are, they understand what the directions are, to the point of getting to the end and realizing that the report says call Marie or something like that. That might not be sufficient. Well, Marie probably could have figured that out at the beginning if that was what she personally had as her practice. And then in the end, you're going to have to report, and that's what everybody keeps telling us. So having the data on which not only to make the report, but also you have to make decisions. And so having those decisions on which to report, whether you decide to report, or you decide not to report, and being able to defend why you made the report the way you did, or you didn't report because it didn't meet a certain threshold, having that data will help you defend your decision and make the right decision at the right time.
So let me build upon that, and I'm going to pick on you and perhaps Ian, anyone else, is that how about running tabletop exercises, especially in larger corporations? Because people assume that their application, they'll have a playbook for their application, and they're ready to go, but oops, the network is still down. Now what do we do? So sequencing, talk about the sequencing and so forth of tabletops.
So CISA does provide a different variety of tabletop exercises, both from the national level to the organizational level down to a department level. And we even have tabletop in a box, where we give you a framework and you fill out the details of how you want to run it. You facilitate that. But because of the variety, we can help and reach out to any organization that wants to test their plan, that wants to maybe do a scenario that is a one-off, something just to kind of get people thinking. We also leverage leadership to make sure they're in the room so that they can make decisions that they need to make, not just technicians, not just engineers. But the idea being CISA can facilitate any exercise needs you have.
Which is pretty cool. Honestly, I think that's a really great service that
And it's free.
that people, organizations in the United States, I mean, that's a real advantage, I think, that people should be taking advantage of. And, so when we think about tabletops, I think about kind of a maturity curve. There are organizations that have never run a tabletop or maybe haven't run one in a few years. And then there are organizations kind of one tier up from that run them maybe every year. That kind of the traditional tabletop is you sit around a literal table and you talk about theoretically what will happen and theoretically what you will do in that situation. In my own experience, a lot of organizations in that situation, they have the incident response plan printed off, sitting on a table, and nobody actually picks it up and reads it or executes it. So that's kind of a funny situation. And then I really, when I think about another level of maturity, is being able to run that tabletop exercise with your team where they are. They're probably not going to all be sitting around a literal table at that moment. And so being able to run that exercise where people are working from home, you have your third party, your lawyer probably doesn't work in your office, they work in their office. Your MSP works in their office. So being able to engage people where they happen to be in that moment so that you have a comprehensive exercise, I think that's another level of maturity that should be considered.
Another thing to add to that would be it's important to do the tabletop, but when you're doing the detailed tabletop for the responders, have not the person who does the day-to-day response actually being the person following the plan. Have it be their backup or someone else, so that you can see that if that person is on vacation, you're not going to be completely at a standstill. And the second piece is you should also periodically do an executive level exercise, because frequently if something gets to be a larger one or it's in the news, it's important to have educated the senior levels within your organization about what sorts of reports there's a fine line between keeping things within and the cover of privilege, and also doing enough communications within your company and with your customers. So it's good to have exercised that ahead of time so that you're not scrambling when a real event happens.
Some years ago, I was involved in a very well-designed tabletop exercise, and I was impressed by all of the preparation, the materials, and just how thorough it was. Unfortunately, when a real event happened, as it turns out of all the people that were involved in the response, I was the only one who was actually ever involved in that tabletop exercise. So literally every single other person was not involved in the response. Defeated the entire purpose of the exercise, which was great on paper, but obviously did not help us when things went south. So training realistically means having the people in the exercise that are actually going to be doing the responding, as opposed to a group of people that may be available but aren't necessarily going to be involved in actually responding to the event. I know that sounds kooky, but that was the outcome.
I just want to add to that, which is, as an incident responder, I have heard many times that people have a plan, they get to the incident, and then they look at the plan, and it's either too little or too much, so they decide to just disregard the plan, they throw it away, and they just go ad hoc. And I think that really speaks to Scott's point, but I don't think that that's a fault of planning. I think that's, to Scott's point, that doesn't make planning wrong. It just means that you need to do it the right way. I think planning is super important, and I think being able to execute on that incident response plan in that moment, having the right plan, really is the essence of where we need to get to so that people can execute on that plan. Because there's a lot of downside risks to not being able to execute your plan.
True. And one thing that came up at a recent event that another CISO said he built into his plan is often when you're under the pressure of a real incident and you're getting hit from above and below, people get very stressed. And so they actually built in some steps about, reminding people that they do have a plan, to take a couple of deep breaths, and to really try to get that calm environment as you're trying to execute, which can be difficult, but whoever the leader is needs to be the one that sort of guides that for the rest of the team and keeps them focused.
Judge, one last piece to that. I think it was Eisenhower that said, planning is essential, the plan itself is irrelevant. Because while you're planning, you're going through those necessary steps to work out the details, the relationships, the contacts, the processes. But at the end of the day, no plan survives contact with the enemy. And so the planning is essential. The plan itself, it may or may not work for you.
So let's go into a little bit further in the plan. What are some of the functions that we should consider to add to our tabletop planning team?
I just want to say, I think one thing that I think most organizations have not yet fully added to their plan is reportability. So being able to collect all of the, we'll call it metadata, of who's doing what throughout the response process, who's doing what, when they did it, why they did that, how it correlates to the plan and what you thought you were going to do, why you did that, why you didn't do that, et cetera, so that you can actually track and record the decisions that you made. I think that's something that is a modern reality, because at some point you may have to defend yourself either to a regulator, to a customer, or to a cyber insurance provider, why you did what you did. And I think if you don't have the means to collect that data, or that you just simply don't collect it, you're going to be in a worse spot. And I think that's something that's really come to life over the last, say, 12 months.
So CISA produced a product a couple years back. It was the Incident Response Playbook, and it's on our website, CISA.gov. It gives you a great foundation document to be able to put your parts in there to handle things the way you need to in your organization. But going back to his question, it will cover all of the required areas to include reporting, because we all have reporting requirements, whether it's to your board or whether it's to a regulator. It's all covered in that playbook.
One of the things that I think is so important but gets missed in these plans is the relationship between your outside counsel and your service providers, okay? And I imagine many of you are familiar with the whole debacle with Capital One, where they had not engaged outside counsel specifically for a breach that happened. They simply used an existing contract, used an existing provider, which I'm sure was doing a great job, but the problem is that there was no thought about specifically contracting for that incident. And when it happened, Capital One couldn't get attorney-client privilege, which really is so important to establish. Now, you may waive it down the road, but you want to at least have that privilege. You want to have what's called attorney work product, meaning that anything that's produced during that incident, because you want to be able to have that for court, you want to be able to protect that. You don't want the other side to get your after-action report. I've had many unpleasant discussions with opposing counsel about this, because they, in contracts, want a copy of the after-action report. Well, that may be privileged, which means that you may now have to set up a privileged and a non-privileged track whenever you're preparing after-action reports. There's a lot more to this, and I don't think those things get considered when these incident plans are put together. I think hopefully now that's something that will be top of mind.
So Scott, could you go a little bit further on the after-action aspect of the incident response?
Sure. What's going to happen is that typically you're going to want to develop some kind of report about what happened, okay? And that's great. You want to have a report. But here's what's important is that you want to keep that to yourself. And down the road, sure, you may want to share it, but establishing your privilege, okay, having outside counsel get involved, essentially oversee the incident, the response to the incident, to engage on the third party, say it's Mandiant or whoever it is, to be able to get them all under a letter of privilege so that everything that happens under that auspice of privilege. That way, if there's litigation, which inevitably there is going to be, all the things that you're talking about for the purpose of getting legal advice, they're not going to be able to expose that to the rest of the world. Now, again, down the road, sure, the company may have to waive that in order to get out of trouble with the feds, but by and large, protecting that is critical. And so you're going to be developing that report in some form or fashion or gathering evidence. You want to be able to protect that. You want to be able to at least not have to hand it over to the opposing counsel in a litigation because you're just essentially doing their job for them. So those two ideas, privilege and attorney work product, it's critical, and it's critical to have that discussion with outside counsel before these things happen, especially for overseas folks, because there's no respect, unfortunately, in Europe for inside counsel. It's only outside counsel that gets that privilege. So that's another dynamic to consider whenever you're putting together your plan.
To add to why the reporting and the after action is so critical, really the planning and then feeding back into your loop can definitely reduce the amount of financial impact that you might have. If you are able to show a regulator the steps that you took during the incident and how you responded, those items are taken into account as they're looking at whether or not you're going to be sanctioned. But in addition, if you've had a similar incident and then you took steps to prevent something and then you have another incident of a similar type, being able to show, well, these are the steps and this was a failure of an individual to follow as opposed to a failure of the program or a technology failure or something like that. So, and then also mentioning the service providers that you have on tap. If you already have that, you can negotiate ahead of time for mitigation services so that when you have to stand up your call center, you already have the contract, you already have the pricing, you're not, you negotiated that ahead of time. And so I can tell you from experience that you can reduce your costs by about 2/3 on a large incident.
I got a question for Steve now. We all have vendors that we use on our network to allow our network to function. So what is the obligation of vendors or service level agreements that we should have in place for incident response?
Well, I mean, I think the service level agreement itself is probably specific to your organization and your business, but at the same time, I think the point is to have a service level agreement. What exactly that is really up to the org, but I think having it is really important. One of the things that we've found is that people just simply forget who their outside vendors are and that they need to be incorporated into the response plan. That there's no means for them all to have access to the plan. I think that's really, like, at some level, like, if you're going to be dependent on your outside counsel or your MSP or incident response provider, you want them to action their actions on your plan, not whatever they're planning to do. So I think just having them, identifying which vendors they are, and then incorporating them not only through an SLA but also through the actions. The other thing I would just say is that now with reporting, it's not just what your team does that may cause reportability, but also what your vendors do. And so what that means is if your outsourced vendor is having a cyber attack, you may have to make a decision on whether or not that means you're having a cyber attack. And so you want to be able to really think about the reporting chain across the entire supply chain of your vendors. For example, if you have an outsourced factory and that factory's outsourced IT provider is having a cyber attack, does that mean you're having a cyber attack? Well, in some cases it does, and in some cases it might not. And so being able to discern that ahead of time is probably going to be pretty important for your ability to report in a timely manner, to make the right decisions. Now, what we do see is that some organizations have very tight reporting windows. So I'm aware of at least one New York money center bank that requires its most important vendors to report a cyber attack within 4 hours, which is a very tight window. And so if your customer happens to be this bank, you may have to have a 4-hour reporting window. So now what that means is not only do you have to report to them based on that SLA, but anybody that is a vendor to you now has to report to you in a certain manner so that you can report to them in that same SLA. So really it takes a lot of thought and I would say, preparation to determine, what is the right flow of information from your vendors to you? How do you make that decision? And then how do you flow it back to your customer?
One of the most important tools you can have to get inside that 4-hour window is a data inventory. And those of you involved in privacy and personal data are already well versed with that. But a data inventory, sometimes it's called records of processing activities in the EU, but it's basically a directory of all of the controlled data you have within your organization, where it is, who's responsible for it, what kind of controls are in place. I used to build those as part of my job. I was with a consulting firm some years ago, and it's amazing how detailed they can get. And when you build those things out, what's interesting is you ask all kinds of questions like, where is the server that holds this data? And who has access to it? And where are all the data flows? And where does it, and what other applications does it flow through? You'll find that you're going to be missing a lot of data that's chained to other data. So maybe you have an HR system that's plugged into an LMS, that's plugged into an expense management system, that's et cetera, et cetera. You're going to find there are all kinds of things you didn't realize are there. Having that data inventory is critical, because then you're going to be able, as soon as something bad happens, to be able to get an idea, okay, these servers are likely implicated. That means this data is mapped to this server. Therefore, we have a fairly good idea inside a 4-hour window of what the scope is, at least by an order of magnitude, and you can give something useful to not just your business partners, but to the authorities, and look like you're on top of the problem.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, one of the examples that you might have is your IT staff might have gotten a report of an incident, and it's a SAP system or something like that. And so they're thinking, well, it's mostly manufacturing, et cetera. We don't have any other types of data in it, but really you do. You have your customer data, with the know your customer rules and having to vet customers most of the time. You have detailed information, and even though it's business contact, if it's Europeans, that's breach reportable data. So being able to say this system has this type of data, and so that was something that not just the record of processing to satisfy GDPR, but just to know your assets, what data is in what systems, and who should have access to it. That helps with all kinds of security aspects, and highly recommend making that inventory and taking the time for that step.
So Marie, quick question for you. How important, in what you just said, how important is to classify your data in advance?
It's pretty important to have a governance structure that lets people know this type of data has this type of regulation associated with it. And so having a data classification schema at your company is really key.
If I can add to that, I spent about 2 years at a defense contractor, and part of my job was managing controlled unclassified information, which now is something that it's certainly much more prevalent than it was way back when. And data classification is invaluable. Just for that, if that was your only use case, controlled unclassified information, and you wanted a justification to do data classification, look no further. Because I can tell you that the folks at DoD and state and all the other 3-letter agencies have a very short fuse when it comes to mishandling data that is contractually obligated theirs, directly or indirectly. And that alone was enough reason for us to establish a data classification system, which ultimately is how I wound up at Spirion. It's kind of a bit of an irony there, but that was the happy outcome. I'm sure the data and everything else was well protected, but the fact that I got a job was just a bonus, I think.
So I just wanted to add to this whole thing is that CISA produces an assessment that we do called the External Dependencies Management Assessment, where it allows you to step back and look at all the dependencies that influence your mission, but that you don't have control over, suppliers, vendors, and allows you to think of your cybersecurity resilience requirements and trying to apply those to contracts, SLAs, and any sort of agreements you have. As an example, imagine a vendor that has to reach into your network through a VPN, putting in the contract to say you must have MFA on all of the accounts that you're using to touch my network. things like that. That's what the EDM pushes for and gives you that insight. A lot of us have never thought that way, and then to be able to work with the contracting folks to get them to change some of that language. That's what the EDM does. So if you're interested, your organization's interested, hit me up after this and we can get you signed up.
One last thought is, Marie kind of spurred an idea for me, and something that Scott said, which is, being able to establish privilege, at least in the United States, is very important so that you can segment, the information that you're sharing and how you have to share it with your attorney. You can kind of cover yourself in the United States, as long as you take action on that at the beginning. And the problem with that is that at the beginning of an incident, you might not know if the incident is actually a security incident or a basic IT operational incident. And so being able to really think about how you will integrate IT operations incidents with your security incidents might be something very important to you, because being able to establish that U.S. privilege, that legal privilege, requires certain kinds of processes. You want to be able to make sure you're following those processes for every single incident, whether you think it's an IT or you think it's a security incident, because if it later on turns out that it is in fact a security incident, you're going to be happy that you followed the process from the beginning.
And an earlier question was, who do you have on your response teams? And when you're exercising them, a really important group to have at the table is your help desk, because a lot of times people will call the help desk thinking it is just some sort of glitch with their system. And then it turns out it's a huge incident, and it was days before it got the notice of the true group that should have responded. So having your help desk and having scripts for them to make sure that they get the right people involved as soon as they get that first call.
That's an interesting point. So Cygnus is basically makes it so that you can have your incident response plan and your contacts in your pocket. It comes as an app. But where I thought that was interesting is that we have someone on my team who runs our customer success team. And she told me this story that she worked at a large software firm previously, and they were all required as customer support people to have the incident response plan with them at all times. And so I asked her, how did she do that? She says, well, I printed it off. I had one from my desk, I had one from my house, and I had one from my briefcase. And I said, well, that's great. And when did you print it off? She says, the first day I started. I said, how long did you work there? She said, 6 years. I said, and how often did you print it off? She says, right. And so being able to have that, not just to your incident response team, but to really everybody who is going to be part of the chain of determining or responding to an incident, I think is very important.
So let's build on that one, is talk about what are the common failings of incident response process. Or let me rephrase it. The Cygnus platform does some things so we don't screw it up on our own.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the most, I thought, compelling stories that I heard was I have a CISO that I've been working with. They've been running quarterly tabletop exercises. They have a plan. They exercise the plan. They're doing the right things in general. But this executive's CEO, who does participate in these quarterly exercises, good for them, came to him and said, look, I think this is pretty interesting. I actually don't mind doing this. I find it kind of clandestine. It's cool to do this. But there's no way I'm going to remember what to do in the moment of an actual crisis, because, to be frank, I'm only sort of paying attention. And so in that moment, this CISO was thinking about, well, what do I need to do to make sure that every one of my executives has the playbook on hand that they can access, where they don't have to read a large textbook, but they're getting more information than a Post-it note, and that they can actually get access to the tasks that are assigned to them. Like, what should I be doing in this moment based on where we are in the response? And so that's really where they did actually start working with Cygnus so that they could have all of their executives have their personal plan in their pocket. That really helped to give that confidence to those executives that they actually would be able to execute their incident response plan in that moment.
So I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to open up the audience for questions. So Ian, where can people go for the information that you referred to that's available free for download?
So CISA.gov is our main site. There's a cyber resources hub that we have that goes into much more detail than we've talked about as far as our assessments, our technical services, our exercise support, and all of that. And I know there's a lot of information out there, but we also do chemical security, we do physical security, we do emergency communications, and it's all on the website, CISA.gov.
Yeah, so one of the things that we found is having a town hall meeting that your senior executive leads, that's like a webinar that can provide an overview of the incident backed up by a website that has FAQs that allows people to submit their own questions that can be vetted. And so we've used that successfully several times so that they hear from the executive leader, but then they can also follow up by going and getting more details. And that way, on your detailed side, you can loop in your legal and your communications functions to make sure that you're saying the same thing to everyone and it's not going to be taken out of context.
Just to add to that, our clients who use Cygnus, the platform, they have a way to create a specific work stream that allows them to keep that kind of information up to date. You can either make it public or you can make it private to certain folks so that they know what the talk track is at any given moment, because that talk track might change throughout the day. And so you might want to have a place where you have information that your certain people know, like your legal team knows, which might be different than what the technical team knows, which might be different information than what you want to tell people. And so having different work streams organized by the different audience and exactly what each different audience should know could be really important and useful in that moment.
So one of the things we've seen is that when there's a external affairs, public affairs type group in an organization, everything all of the communication out funnels through them. The legal team works with them to make sure they're saying the right things, but that everybody's getting the same message. It's not engineering and IT and business and ops all saying something different. Everything goes through that group for social media purposes, for news purposes, for communicating to customers. Those we've seen the best success from.
Your question.
Hello. My employer has to comply by PCI standards. We have to go through the regular tabletop incidences, BCP, DRP. My question is, should we leverage a third-party organization to do a tabletop incident for us, since the yearly incident exercises that we do are becoming kind of stale? What's your experience? Do you recommend it? A third party that does
My opinion is that you should go out to a third party because you don't know what you're missing. If you're just doing internal, there may be pieces of an incident that you might not be analyzing deep enough. So I think you should, whether it's a paid party or a free third party, definitely working outside of your organization.
And just to add to that, I think from my experience of just watching organizations and tabletop facilitators work during a tabletop, I think there's a lot of you could delude yourself pretty easily if you're running your own scenario as a tabletop, and your team is the one that's responding to that situation. I think it's very easy to talk your way through things that you might do, but that you actually have no means to do. And so I think having a third party help to make sure that you actually have that means is really important.
I agree with everything that everyone said already. I would add to that, not only do you want to have a third party run it, because they're going to be much tougher on you than you would certainly on yourself, but then the metrics that you get out of that really is something that in the quarterly or annual report that the CISO is going to give to the board of directors, who is now much, much more involved in this process. That's a huge metric to say, from tabletop to tabletop, we improved our response time by this, we improved something else by that. That's the kind of metrics they want to hear, and it's important to them. And remember, a CISO may only get 2 minutes, quite literally, in front of a board, which I think is criminal, but that's a different discussion. The fact that they can only get a half dozen statistics, that's likely going to be one of them.
There's a, oh, yeah.
I've got the gourd, so I get to talk. Thanks for joining us today. Marie, this is kind of a question of the flip side of a scenario you put forth a moment ago, something I like to call the WebMD effect. Somebody has screamed breach, and possibly publicly, it's really more of a misconfiguration. How are you walking that back within your organization, and how are you walking that back with people that might have dealt with that on the outside? Oh my gosh, you've had a breach. No, we really haven't. How's that working within your groups?
So I think the message about having all of your communications go through your company relations as well as legal is really the most critical when something like that happens. And not having a reporter who might call you out of the blue, try to get you to say something or to quote you, which will happen, by the way. They'll find you and they might call you. And so having all of your team know to say, corporate communications is handling this, here's how you can reach them, is really important.
It's okay, Dominic retired.
Okay. Okay, thank you for your time. So I have a question about the recent US, the SEC cyber disclosure, right? I'm just wondering, how does that change your current process for incident response? And in particular, well, we know that all this, like financial, the materiality assessment, all of that, does that mean that CFO should be looped in at the very beginning of, an incident? Because I'm just wondering, do your current like CISO or even like CT or CIO, do they have the capability or the knowledge to be able to determine the financial implication at the very beginning, like to determine if they should include the CFO?
So maybe I'll just start. And so in many ways, it does not change the processes that you should go through. In many cases, you should be doing much of that work anyway. But what does change is that there should be now a formal framework for making a decision on materiality and having that data on which you're going to make the decisions. And as I've mentioned already in my talk, not making the decision or making a decision that you will not report because it is not material. And I think, in fact, there are some news articles recently about organizations that said that they had a sophisticated cyber situation in place, and now the SEC is basically asking that may or may not be true. And so being able to demonstrate that you made a decision based on data, I think is very important. And to me, that is probably the biggest change that I see. In addition to your point, which stakeholders will be assessing that data to make that decision. So yes, it looks like to make a materiality decision, most of the organizations that I'm working with are saying that it's the CEO, the general counsel, the CFO, and the CISO working together to make that decision based on data that is being collected primarily by the CISO and then processed against a framework to determine its materiality. I think that data collection and using that as the basis of your decision, documenting, yes, we made this decision, or we made this decision not to report, and being able to go back and defend yourself, I think that is the primary change. That's my perspective.
All right, thank you.